knowledge and training support, it's probably a nice way of saying that I get the bits of the department that they don't really know what to do with. Like so, my training support elements are campus services. I run the facility here and the applied training or practical learning environment. So I've got teams that build the scenarios to apply the knowledge in a training environment that then get sent out onto the road. And my knowledge elements that I look after, a little bit of background in training product development. I have a doctrine or operational policy team, and my newly acquired lessons management team of one, which I've seen is a bit of a theme across the board, the investment into those things that aren't bright and shiny, don't flash, aren't very announceable, and you can cut a ribbon in front of. It seems to be a bit of a difficult way to push and get resources and grunt and backing and support. So the presentation this afternoon, or this afternoon for me, this evening for you, is as much about embedding good practice or embedding or positioning knowledge within an organisation, an operational organisation, and a little bit of nudge theory in there as well, as it is about the lessons. The positioning of knowledge within the organisation, within DFES, has been really difficult. From the conversations that we've just had in the lead out there, it doesn't sound like it's unusual. It sounds as though the things that people have been grappling with, whether in emergency services or not, or in project land, are all reasonably the same. When I talk to my training product development team, every time they develop a product, it's a project. When I talk to my lessons management, so my doctrine team, whenever they develop a new SAP, there's a 3-letter acronym, it's a project. An AAR is a project. How did I think Simon was saying earlier on, how do we learn, how do we embed those previous experiences at the front end of that project cycle? So within DFES is a large, fast-paced in some aspects, slow government organisation in others. 30% or 40% of our staff, uniform, non-uniform staff, are involved in operations for about 4 months of the year. They're the ones that are also doing the work for all the rest of the year. So we've got kind of a 2-speed economy for the way we operate. We look after 6 emergency services streams, but all under the same governance and administration structure. About 1,500 uniform, non-uniform staff, and about 20,000 volunteers. Some of them who don't want to know anything about us, to be honest. Some of them who just want to go farmer response units, who just want to go out, put fires out and come home. They're not particularly interested in governance structures or doctrine structures or those type of things. About 2.5 million square kilometres is a jurisdiction, and we go from Kununurra down to Albany and then the Perth Metro and across to Eucla and the Wheat Belt. What we've noticed, and I mentioned it in the early blurb, is the demands for knowledge and the contributions for knowledge products varies massively across our remit. Our operational staff have particular needs. They've got needs where they need to access our knowledge products really quickly at times, because they're in a position where they have not a lot of discretionary time, a lot of time to think. So the team that builds the knowledge products for them need to use language conventions and readability scales that allows them to extract the information they need in quick time. Others, we rely on training, the training component of operational knowledge, to embed those good practices and procedures. Over the journey, the knowledge environment in DFES has been heavily reliant on tacit knowledge, and I'm hearing that across the board. That tacit knowledge, that the stuff that's in people's heads, the stalwart that's been around for 30 to 40 years, who's experienced the local conditions, who understands the interaction between brigade members and just gets things done, we relied heavily on that. We've tried to make a push into some more explicit knowledge. The document stuff through our doctrine team and operational knowledge team, and organisational knowledge. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on what organisational knowledge is and how we actually capture that. That's a really interesting thing to me. The lessons management space has had a number of kick-arounds. It has gone through an investigative stage where it was incident review and analysis, quite led by ex-police officers, which was quite a punitive and quite a more of an evidence-gathering, fact-finding and finger-pointing exercise, which is something that we think has kind of destroyed the trust in the lessons management component that we need to rebuild. We've attempted to establish, I'm going to use my lack of technical ability here, we've attempted to establish, establish a discrete knowledge manager. We worked quite hard, a couple of us worked quite hard to, if you can see that, a couple of us worked quite hard to establish a discrete knowledge manager, and that was the result. We tried from a couple of angles, we just couldn't land that knowledge management section. The research committee tried, I've tried through my team, and we just couldn't. We saw the importance of it, but we just couldn't land it. So what we found is that whilst that was the case, we remained at risk of those things that we talked about earlier, of the reliance on tacit knowledge to keep things going. And what I'm keen to find out, I've got some views, but I'm keen to find out from the forum here is, what are the risks associated with that? What are we up against if DFES as an organisation is relying mostly or greatly on tacit knowledge to maintain and sustain operations? What are we at risk of? Can I throw that to the group, Stuart? And I'm going to use my Miro board to document. So what am I, if I can ask, what am I at risk of? I've got a couple of things. We're at risk of organisational change, people leaving through either machinery of government changes, those type of things. I kind of want to know what I don't know in that space.
Feel free to add your thoughts, everyone. I know, Brad, you've got that amazing book on NASA, the research they did on the handover from the baby boomers to the next generation and the massive knowledge loss.
That's us, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I have that book, Stu, but I mean, I did some reading and thinking around what happens when people retire from organizations, right? So obviously, Clinton, the most obvious one that you probably got on top of your list is knowledge loss. So, 30, 40 years of expertise leaving with one person, multiply that by 10, 20, 30 people, and that's a huge gap. And attached to that is the loss of institutional memory. It's not just about, so the policies and the doctrine and the operating procedures you have now are based on incidents that have happened and lessons learned, ironically. Something went wrong, people did a review, and they went, what did we learn from this experience and what do we do differently? Which then became doctrine and policy. Now, the people that were there at the time of the incident, and they remember what happened, and they will remember the series of decisions that were made, when they leave, that goes with them. So if you think about, if I quote Shrek, knowledge management is like an onion. There's layers and layers and layers and layers. And one of those layers is that institutional memory that's attached to people that doesn't stay in their role. Anyone else want to hop in?
If you look at the report into the Kangaroo Island fires, 2019, that highlights, I think, 5 lessons which were learned in 2007, went right through the full system, signed off, action plans completed, which were unlearned by 2019 and repeated. I have no concrete evidence, but based on my anecdotal conversations, it was because the tacit knowledge had left the organisation, or left that part of the organisation. So what I've done, and picking up Stuart's point about moving out of emergency services, ISO 30414 is the human capital reporting standard, which you have to have if you report to the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US. Part of that asks you nasty questions like, what percentage of your current positions were filled by planned succession or planned to be filled? And it seems to me that a simple thing like planned succession is absolutely essential if you're going to maintain the tacit knowledge of what explicit knowledge exists and when to use it. And I think they were 2 critical factors if I go back and reread that Kangaroo Island report. Nick Milton and I at NOCO talk about lessons learned as a knowledge supply chain. We've applied supply chain methodology to it. So your lessons learned system is a continuous supply of lessons learned, and it's going to be continuous, and you're going to get repeats. There's no doubt about that. But I think this concept that you've got to maintain the tacit knowledge as well is something that people overlook in concentrating on making everything explicit.
Yeah, that's really good, and to get everything explicit is massive. That's a massive volume. There's tones in there, so there's a bit of storytelling in there as well. I really like the commentary on the chat as well around knowledge hoarding. That's interesting. There's some risk in that. And there's also, on the one side is knowledge hoarding. There's a component of the reliance on tacit knowledge, but then there's assumed knowledge that surely everyone knows this. And that's probably the one that I can see from where I sit from a training point of view across training, the doctrine and within lessons, is this assumed knowledge. I even see it in a practical learning environment where we train people to undertake duties, but it's not how we do it in the real world. So,
Clinton, you referred to earlier to the operational timescale of action. And in the heat of battle, the last thing you're going to do is go and look up a lesson, right? It's got to be established well before that. It's got to be in the training. It's got to be in the way in which you react. You haven't got time. The only organisation I know of where the lessons learned are at the start of a project is Jeff Cooper's Army, and they don't do it at the start of a project. They do it on a person's reassignment, and when they're reassigned, the Lessons Learned Centre hands them, based on your experience, here's a set of lessons that you need to know about right now. Now, that's the only time I've ever heard of it working, right? If you're doing project initiation in a construction company, you haven't got time to worry about what people did wrong before. You just haven't got time. You've got so much on your plate. And so it doesn't work there. You've got to have it established. You've got to have it embedded in the system. Yeah. And that's why, to pick up Shah's point, we altered the definition of lessons learned in 30401 to say it's the action taken as a result of a lesson.
Yeah, nice.
Really critical. Sorry, Steve.
I was just going to say, I have seen it work in one place, Ian, at the start of projects. That was in oil and gas, but it failed initially. It only worked when they didn't allow the budget to be approved until you had done your peer assists. And boy, it worked then. It worked internationally then. But it took that force. You don't do your peer assists, you don't get your money. And maybe that's what it takes.
Probably.
Yes, Stu, I'm going to ask it at a point in time. What are the levers? What are the levers I can use and pull on an organisation? What are the levers that I can convince that authorising environment? I've used a couple already, but I'm going to be looking at what are the levers we can reach in to make lessons important all the time. Lessons management is a bit of a catch-cry. It's a bit of a nice way for senior leaders, politicians, whatever it is, say, yeah, we're going to learn from this, and then move on. When does lessons become important? Usually when there's an inquiry that identifies that we should have known it before. When does lessons become important? It's usually when there's about to be an inquiry. When is lessons important? I saw this on the weekend in Western Australia. A job I was at during summer, an incident I was out in summer, has now gone to litigation. And the Deputy Commissioner for DFES has quoted in the paper saying we always learn from our incidents. Do we? Should we? I can see a bit of downhill pressure coming on me now to make sure that we do from that one. So I can see the snowball coming. I can see it coming. And I know who it's going to land on. So what I'm interested in here is making sure that I've got a really strong understanding of where lessons is at, a really good authorising environment, and then some workflows to go through. Really important. So there's a lessons management cycle, and apologies for jumping in and out of this, but I'm going to give this a go. No, that didn't work again. Where I'm going to jump in and out of this. So the question is when is lessons important in government agencies? And it is usually, this is from the 2004 McLeod report after Charter Nation. It's usually on the right-hand side. Major bushfire event, accusations and blames. Did we learn anything previously? What are we going to have a swing at you now? There's a government or independent inquiry with consequences. Did we learn anything before? How come you didn't know? How come you didn't learn it? I think you made mention Ian, of the Kangaroo Island fire, and that was mentioned before. That's at the Lessons Management Forum. The first thing you should do is implement all the recommendations that were recommended beforehand. So when does lessons management appear to be important? It's during those areas. What my job is going to be is to even out the focus on lessons and try to use it as a capability enabler. Try to change the narrative around lessons from being reactive and triggered by something to being more consistently applied. That's what I was interested in that uptake or the feedback from the team. So we get those observations all the time, and we can assess them on a couple of levels. I fell into knowledge management. I fell into lessons management. It came to me. I didn't seek it. So what I typically do when I land in a new seat, and what I say to my team is, I've landed on Mars. I don't speak a word of Martian, and I'm the king. So I need to learn the language quickly and need to learn what's my left and right. So what I did was go to the handbook, and a number of you will be aware of the Lessons Management Handbook. Handbook I found to be really, really useful. Also found it's got limitations. I found it to be really, really useful in explaining and setting up that, one, it's an authorising environment, it's an industry-related or a peer-reviewed and industry-referenced document. Really, really strong for me to pitch why we're moving from that investigative mode to a more enabling mode, because not everyone agrees with that. Not everyone agrees with that, and I'm having some resistance to that shift. There's a bit of hanging on pretty tightly. I used to look after it. Why are you changing my thing? There's a little bit of that. But I'm looking at this as an authorising environment, and I like how it's been set out. It's quite a nice, clear and consistent methodology to gather evidence and observations, to form insights and lessons, and I'll come to that in a tick. There's elements that are missing in there for me, and that's the implementation bit. That's the bit that I think we've talked about. I think Shah mentioned it in the gathering of observations and lessons is really good and important, but what do we do with them? I've had discussions with some counterparts from other agencies, and they've shown me a list of 47 lessons from a post-season review. And my response to him, after I looked at it, I went, I don't think they're all lessons, but we've all got different views on that. How many of them have you implemented? What have you done with them? How many of them have been actioned? And not one of them was actioned.
Yeah.
Who owns them? Who is the responsible party for them? What's the authorisation to do that work? So that's the bit that the Lessons Management Handbook can't talk about, because that's jurisdictional based. That's agency based. That's the specific nuance that is throughout what we do. We've gone through an environment where emergency services, and you'll see it now through the New South Wales floods, particularly in Lismore, but also through COVID, through an environment where there's a politicisation of emergency services. The ministers are now standing in front of communities saying, we will learn from this. So we have to. There's an inquiry. So when I joined the job in 2002, there wasn't inquiries. We didn't have inquiries. The fire brigade was the good old boys, get up, fire goes out, and everyone high fives and walks away. Now there's inquiry after inquiry after inquiry. The frequency of inquiries is increasing. The transparency of our actions is increasing with social media and media access, actually, and a desire to feed the beast. Community expectation has increased. Now, whether resilience has dropped away or there's a bit more of a balancing act, I don't know. But community expectations of services has increased, and with that it comes an expectation of service. I'm paying fee for service here as well, so that varies from community to community that we deal with. So lessons has been politicised. There's almost a review every post-disaster. There's now an expectations from our operational staff that they're going to be involved in a review. They want that feedback, they want that voice, and we should give it to them. I've got one person in my team. And I think through Stuart's team, one person, so with high turnover as well. So how do we create that stable and sustainable lessons platform to feed back into the operational knowledge management loop. Again, a question for the group is, I've positioned, and we tried to get knowledge management at an agency level, at a whole organisation level. That became too hard. There was a fair bit of resistance to the idea, and probably a little bit of resistance to the concept, not knowing the concept. So what do? You fall back and control the controllables. And within that, I was fortunate enough to be responsible for the areas within DFES that could talk to each other, from training, product development, doctrine and lessons management. So I drafted a new policy called the Operational Knowledge Management Policy, which stitched those areas together. So if I left, then that existed beyond my time. So that's what I talk about when I'd start talking about creating an authorising environment. It's not me. I'm garnering support. I'm using a bit of nudge here and there. I quite like that. I'm trying to line up a couple of processes well ahead of time to deliberately shape the narrative. So it makes it easy for those decision makers down the line that don't know that they're going to be asked to do things to make those decisions. So make it easy for them to say yes, because they've got confidence that all these checks are now in place. So my line to all of my staff is, if you want something, you've got to make it easy for the decision maker to say yes. So give them confidence, de-risk it, give them confidence that it's got a framework around it. So I go back to that ADA handbook, and I found it really, really good. It gave us some definitions to work with. Lisa Spatch is my current lessons manager, but I've only got her for a little while, but she's got a project management mindset, and I'll leverage from that as much as I can. So we've used the OIL methodology that's been put in the ADA handbook. So observations, and in brackets, evidence. So we gather observations and evidence. We elicit them from interviews, from formal debriefs, individuals just providing observations through tropical cyclone Saroja. We had 670 individual observations that were pulled apart and coded. Some of them were just comments and suggestions, but we had to go through that data. Then we typically, I'll just give a bit of an overview of that. So typically 3 observations or make an insight, or a critical observation makes an insight. So that removes the loudest voice in the room from dominating the conversation. I really like the way that that's been framed up. I really think that's really powerful for the quiet, considerate, and reflective thinker, that they've got as much weight in the conversation as the alpha, uniformed alpha male, the instant controller. That observation is neutralised and given exactly the same amount of weight, depending on what it is. So typically 3 insights three observations make an insight, or a significant observation against the terms of reference. So we also have a lot of terms of reference, and I'll come to that a bit later on. Once we have an insight, then we've got to work out whether that insight is actually a lesson. And I'll be interested to hear from the floor is what's a lesson? What's a lesson? ADA handbook's got a definition of it, but I'll be interested to hear what you would consider a lesson, the difference between an insight and a lesson. Because it's really important in the action component. And I'll come to that in a bit. I found it really, really important when we talk about actions, and I don't talk recommendations. I talk insights, lessons, actions. A bit like EMV's got that in their model as well. Emergency Management Victoria's got that in their model. But what's a lesson? What's a lesson in the other worlds? I'm really interested actually from the non-emergency services world, because we know what we know, but I think it's interesting to get a bit of balanced perspective on that. Stu, if I can throw to you to facilitate.
Yeah, please. Well, does anyone want to jump in on that? I know we've got we had Ian talking just before about that he noticed that insights and lessons were a one-to-one match. But we've got Mark Cuthbert in the room. Bert, are you there? Can you maybe set the picture of what the official version is, and then get everyone to beat off that?
Thanks, Stu. Yeah, I won't go with the official version. I'll go with the Bert version. So my definition of a lesson is something that can be learned. So I think many of the recurring issues that we see, particularly at the strategic level, are not lessons and will never be learned. So day to day, we do pretty well. It's out of scale events that get us to Royal Commissions. I can't remember who I stole the quote from, but all your knowledge and all your lessons are about the past, and all your problems and all your decisions are about the future. So I haven't responded. I haven't had a chance to respond to your LinkedIn quote about learning culture, but I think learning culture's only there to enable learning organisations. Where the world continues to get more complex, regardless of the reason, and people continue to churn faster and faster. How do we build people and organisations that are flexible enough to take the available knowledge and adapt to emerging situations when we don't know what's coming? So it's that complexity where past knowledge is useful, but we suffer in Australia from recognition prime decision making, where we have incident controllers that have limited experience and go, have I seen this before? Yes, I've seen this before. What happened last time I did this? Did that work? Yes. That's fine when they did see it before, but when they're looking at something that is different than what they've dealt with before, and they don't have the expertise, they don't have the multi-functional, multi-generational support to decision making, that's when we end up in royal commissions and formal inquiries. So I think a lesson is something that can be learned, and a lot of the stuff that we see, the politicians stand up and say, we're going to learn from this. Well, we're not, because on a catastrophic day, things are never going to be perfect. So that's my executive summary. I'll shut up there.
Very good. Thanks, Bert. Anyone else? What's a lesson for you?
I think it needs to be evidence-based. So something that we need to have some fact and also a context around that. Not sure whether it must involve human or not, but I guess normally it will. And also the circumstances, which I think where context is coming up, because the same lessons that in certain contexts may not be able to apply to another context.
I really like that, Dick. That's a really good point for me, and something we've been trying to get with our team. In some of our previous AARs, after action reviews that I've seen, it doesn't have that robustness, it doesn't have that rigour, and I've made that really strong with my team, that everything that we're producing, because it will be challenged for some of the high level after action reviews for the big incidents, and not necessarily coronial, but the big incidents, we're seeing challenges at ministerial levels. I'm getting them on a daily basis. So if we've made stuff up, if we don't have that rigour and robustness, that evidence base, that we can track it back to observations, even if it's observations, that we can say, well, actually we had 50 observations around that, so it's a thing. It's a thing. It came from there. There's no, I've seen how agendas can come in, and we're going to write this lesson over here because we want to get this project over the line. That manipulation of the process. So I'm kind of fighting a couple of things, but I really like that. I think it's really strong, and something that can be learned. I think that throws up a few questions as well. I think in there, Bert, as well. So what can be learned? Are we ready to receive that lesson? Is another interesting thing, another interesting perspective. Am I ready to receive it as an organisation and do something with it, or do we tick the box and move on? Which is
a word of caution, Clinton. The no-go methodology insists that those observations have been verified by a subject matter expert before you take them forward. You can't just rely on the prima facie observation. It has to be verified.
Yeah, we've certainly appreciate that. We've come across that too. That verification, it's slower. It's slower than a lot of people would like, which is we cop a lot of criticism for that with my team of one, as I keep saying. Definitely slower than we'd like, but that's a bit that we hold very strongly to.
But your team are not the subject matter experts. It's your team's job to pass it out to the subject matter expert to verify.
Yep, I absolutely agree. And that's actually something that I learned from my training product development and the doctrine development as well. Otherwise, you end up in the world according to whoever's writing it. History is written by the person who pays the author, not necessarily by the wisdom of the commons.
So I hear what you're saying about resources, though, Clint. Kat is brilliant at going to the SMEs, but I think she's waiting on about 5 of them at the moment to get information back to her. I was telling you about that earlier today, and it's hard because they're busy as well, and you have deadlines. You've got to get things out, so it's hard.
Yeah.
Shah?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, just to go back to that distinction between insight and lesson. I think from my experience of lessons learned, it's really a very collaborative process. It's you can have a lot of insights, individual insights, and so on. But I think in the whole process of lessons learned is about collaboration among a number of people, whereby you actually challenge certain understandings. You might have a particular understanding about what went wrong or what could have been improved, but it's in that conversation that you have with others that you come to that shared understanding and agreement about, okay, so this is the way we really want to change the way we act and work. So I think that collaboration is a really important aspect. And it's also important because, as I referred to before, I think lessons learned is really about changing behaviors and changing the culture of the way we work, because too often we just lapse into habits and what's worked before and what we're comfortable doing, and that is why mistakes recur, and we're condemned to repeating mistakes. So that cultural aspect is really, really important, and that's why I think the way you draw out lessons is quite critical to that, and it's that challenging each other's understandings and really looking at how we can change those behaviors in that collaborative way. And I agree with the comments have been made before about drawing in expertise. I think that's really important to do that. But yeah, so that's, sorry, long-winded way of saying that's a distinction for me between the insights and the lessons. Insights can be very individual. Lessons are a group activity to come to an understanding of what's actionable, what can be changed in the way we're working and the way we usually deliver on our projects and so on.
So before I came across the handbook that was mentioned before, my idea of insights and lessons was actually that they're very similar things. The difference is an insight is looking at the problem, but a lesson is looking at the solutions. And so you've got this key transition point between an insight and a lesson where you're going from understanding the nature of the problem to understanding the nature of possible actions. They then lead to actual actions. And that's why then you need that evaluation loop. Now I've read the handbook, I'm not quite sure that's the right way of thinking, but I still have that in the back of my head that there's this transition from looking at the problem to looking at what we're going to do about it. And those two, for me, seem to be a nice dividing line. Then.
I appreciate the conversation around that, because whilst the handbook's got a definition, and the definition is the one that we're holding to, we're even, as my team are coding the observations and theming them, we're still grappling with, is it an insight, is it a lesson? So the AIDA handbook describes a lesson as new knowledge or understanding. That for me is really important. And it's important for me, by the way, we do take the next step. What's the action? What's the action? What does that mean? If it's new knowledge or understanding, that's new organisational knowledge. That's a blind spot. That's potentially a systemic gap in our capability, in our knowledge. That's what we're triaging at the moment. And I'll come to the capability models we're assessing them against. That's really important. The lesson, I think the Kangaroo Island, if I can steal someone else's presentation, Kangaroo Island fire in 2019, there was about 6,500 observations, about, I'm going to get this wrong, I was going to say 35 to 40 odd insights and about 20 lessons. Would that be right, Ian? I'm seeing some nodding.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, that would be normal. Yeah,
so I have seen lists of 47 lessons, and some of them about the catering was crap. Well, that's not a lesson. That's not a lesson. So in other reports. So we really need to change and challenge and define. So when I present my high-level reports back to our corporate executive, and they're going to commit to a course of action, I need to be really strong about what it is that this AAR, after action review or lessons management process, has actually found, and what are we going to do with it. The insights, well, I'm treating more around, that's interesting. Do we do something about that or not? Is that a more of a business as usual function? Is that something that we can address, raise, consider? We know about it. Are we just not treating it appropriately? Versus that lesson, which is that organisational blind spot. So I had a conversation with Stu earlier on today. I understand that there's a negative connotation. We're always treating the problem, and there's potential to miss out on the innovation component. I get that, and I'm going to hold that, Stu. Won't have any conversation. I'm going to hold that and ruminate on that over time to work out how look to move forward. Really importantly for me, in framing the difference between a lesson and an insight, is that what are we going to do with it? What value does it add to the organisation? Again, the question for the group is, what value does it add to the organisation? What levers can we pull on to make people interested in this stuff? Because lessons, that means somewhere along the line, someone's put their hand up. Well, someone maybe hasn't done their job. An environmental scan hasn't picked up something new. A capability model has got a gap in it. It means that we're probably going to put our hand out for more money at some stage, which means Treasury is going to get involved. That's the reality. Actions mean money, or a changing process that people may be resistant from. I'm going to keep rolling on through this, but it was really clear to me in and around discussing with Lisa, my lessons manager, around, okay, lesson versus insight, what do we do with it? What value does lessons management, the business unit, add to DFES? What do we bring to the party? How do we make people sit up and notice? Yes, I've done the work in the background. I've got my authorising environment. I've got a new operational knowledge policy. I've actually written a new learning and development policy, and we've written a new lessons management policy. Funnily enough, they're all written by kind of me and my teams, and they all talk to each other. So if I had a mustache, I'd twirl it. It's a very nice way to frame up the next statement which is, boss, how can I help you? How can I protect you? So myself and my team created a very clear and very simple purpose statement, which clearly separated from the investigation side of lessons management, and very clearly from operational lessons management. I can't do it for the whole organisation because I've got one body. Focusing on operational lessons management, our purpose statement is very clearly about sustaining or improving operational outcomes. That's it. Lessons management, the purpose of lessons management is to sustain or improve operational outcomes. DC operations signed off on that. Our Deputy Commissioner signed off on that, because that sounds like a really good thing that we should be doing. Sustaining or improving operational outcomes. And boss, here's the ARDR handbook that I'm going to refer to while I'm doing that. So my authorising environment has got a couple of elements to it that then pitches the discussion piece around the next piece, which is our methodology. And my focus is on operationalising those lessons, operationalising the knowledge and operationalising those lessons. If we don't do that, then we're just doing stuff, we're ticking boxes and moving on. So when I talk about operationalising knowledge or operationalising lessons, it's about making sure that we have meaningful impact in the operational space. Does that resonate with people? Because if it doesn't, I'm missing the mark. It's more than an intellectual exercise. It's where the theory meets the practice, and it gets punched in the face and then comes back again. You know, it's where the theory meets the practice. And if we're doing it as an intellectual exercise, which I'm quite happy to do, by the way, I'm becoming a closet nerd, and Stu introduced me to the Cynefin framework, and stuff's gone mad. But it's been really, really important to understand how we actually draw what is quite a high level insider lesson, drive it through the organisation and have meaningful impact for us to the community. Yeah. Really, it's a really clear line of sight for me.
Can I ask a question, Clinton? Do you have any KPIs associated with, the key lessons? What kind of improvements you want to see? And is that possible?
I'm hoping so. So I'm going to try and build some. At the risk of setting myself up to fail, KPIs in government agencies are a little wobbly at the best of times. We've got some metrics from the State Emergency Management Committee that says we're actually not doing very well in lessons, embedding those things and changing policies. We're probably not so much a KPI, but there's some reporting targets that are being reported on our behalf. What I'm going to try and do is actually develop some measures. I haven't done it. So to answer your question, no, I don't have KPIs. And I don't own the actions. It's really clear that I don't own the actions. I can't own the actions. Myself and my team will get us to a point where we've got, as Ian pointed out very clearly, validated insights and lessons. It goes to a operational service delivery committee of the key people, decision makers, that if they endorse it, now we have to do something We have to do some of those lessons and insights. That's the action bit. Really clearly, and it used to be the case that lessons management owned all the actions. If we've got a systemic organisational blind spot, what am I going to do about that?
Yeah.
So to answer your question, no, there's not discrete KPIs. Yes, we'd like to create some measures that I can draw on to see whether I'm winning or losing. If I'm not winning, a bit like running an incident. If you're not winning, there's only one other option. So I'm really interested in that. What I'm going to try and do, before I get to the next step, I'll bring up the next slide. I'll premise that I'm anchoring it into capability models, organisational capability models, is my vehicle to sustain or improve operational outcomes. The Deputy Commissioner of Operations, a bit like an operations officer in a private organisation, they own operations. Craig Waters is the man. He owns operations. If he's not interested in it, in improving or sustaining operational outcomes, then, why should I be? Oops. I'm still having a hang of this. So within the Lessons Management Handbook, I've covered off that in the top left-hand quadrant, the governance. That's my authorising environment. I've tried to get some leadership involved. I've co-opted leadership. I've co-opted 2 deputy commissioners. I've co-opted my assistant commissioner. I've co-opted a few people around me. It's a bit of a Star Wars cantina bar kind of configuration of people who might not always know quite what they've signed up to. Might not always, but I actually said to my deputy commissioner, I need you to trust me. And that could be very career limiting or very good for down the track. But I said, I need you to trust me on this. I just need you to back me in. Turns out we're on station together many years ago, so that's helpful. But look at him and look at me. So setting up that governance and leadership and accountability, the leadership component, I could do with a bit more advocacy and a bit more grunt out of that. We do need that lead out. That's the salesman, the lead out at the big table at the corporate executive level to go, yeah, I'm going to support this. The methodology, I'll come to in a minute. The capability within the team and the communication and engagement. And at the centre of this is the point that Stu raised in his LinkedIn post around the learning culture. The components that I took out of our earlier conversation and the components that I'm probably most mindful of is we talk about learning cultures, but to have a learning culture, we need to be truthful to ourselves. We need to have a degree of vulnerability and trust each other. And they're for me, for us to go, actually we found these lessons that we weren't very good in this bit. What are we going to do about it? And then trust that trust that evidence base is there that Nick mentioned, and trust that, okay, well, if we're going to do it, that means we're committing the whole hog and we're going to see this through. So that learning culture, I think we grapple with a little bit. It also involves change. And there's a saying in emergency services, particularly in fire brigades, that one thing that fireys hate is the way things are, and the other thing they hate is change. So we constantly grapple with that dichotomy, that push and pull of, wow, we need to change everything, but don't change anything while I'm here. Or they come back and it's all changed. I'll go back to the way it was. So we've got to bridge that gap as well. The proposed methodology that we're looking at is linked. The one on the left-hand side, the one in purple, is the AIDR handbook methodology of oil. It's quite strong at the front end in the collection observation, but as we go into validation, implementation and monitoring, whilst there's one line there, that's the bit. That's the bit that most organisations struggle with. And in the recent Lessons Management Forum from ADAR and AFAC, that was the bit that I could sense that everyone was struggling with. How do we implement? How do we make it stick? How do we sustain change? The one on the right, whilst it's very wordy and colourful, is how Lisa's project management mind dissected that bit. That we have some terms of reference. We have the yellow bit is the governance around an after action review. And this can be scaled up or down, low level, or the last two I've been doing will be significant major state level events. We collect, we analyse those operational SME loop. That's that validation component. We grab them in and then we draft the report and have the report done. We separate the report, the lessons identified from the actions. We separate the insights, the lessons identified from the actions. The blue bit, there's another workflow that falls out of that. That's the actions bit. We don't own that. We'll facilitate that, but we can't own that. The business has to own that. The business has to own it. And what we're going to try and do, again, if I had a mustache or twirl it, is the people who sit at that table are the delegates of the one that says OSDC. So by the time the actions come back around to OSDC, they've had skin in the game the whole way. So it's no surprise. They can write them into business plans. They can write them into planning, funding submissions. They can adjust. They can do the business as usual activities, and some of those actions will just fall out. What we're expecting is most of the actions that are tactical will be part of business as usual. Most of the actions that relate to, and they're mostly around insights. Most of the actions that are strategic or enterprise level are systemic, and they're going to require a high level of governance. They're projects. They're large-scale organisational projects, and that moves through to the other end. It comes out as 3 options to the executive. It's business as usual, all approved by our corporate executive. It goes to a project proposal, that's a sitcom bit. Or we identify and it goes to an external agency, noting that we can't tell Department of Health or Department of Communities what to do. We don't have that authority. What we can do is go, we found this. We're going to report what we found at a State Emergency Management Committee meeting, and if you want us to explore that with you a bit more, we'll do that. But you own it. That was a source of some frustration. In a private sector, that might be an interdepartmental discussion about who owns it. From a project management perspective, it might be, well, we've got some connections that link up to the other project over there. So it was really important for us to break out who owns what and use everything in the purple is an existing governance structure. We haven't created anything new because those people are busy and we can't own it. So by the time it leaves us in lessons management, it's now in a business as usual workflow when the governance structures are there and it's overseen by our audit and risk committee because now we know. Now we know those blind spots. That represents a level of enterprise risk. I'll pause there for any comments around that process or that slide. It's very jurisdictional based, it's very organisational based, but the workflow is governance over the top, report, lessons identified and report presented to an authorised body. Actions are developed separately to the report, which means we can table the report. Actions are slower, actions get spat out, go through an authorised body and then either accepted, we might accept some of those enterprise risks, or we put it on the table for a funding submission back to Treasury. I'll pause for a little bit and see if there's any commentary around that.
Kat, do you have any comments on that?
Sorry, it's just fine. Right, unmute. Yeah, my just question is, consists in that committee of yours, that the authorised body?
Yep. Who sits in it?
Yes.
What level?
As in, is it your execs? Is it our broker base?
Yeah, second level exec. So assistant commissioner level. So director, executive director kind of level. Assistant commissioner, chief superintendent in our parlance. Maybe a deputy director and a director level in other agencies. They've got a degree of authority and autonomy. They've got and responsibility and accountability. So that OSDC is the Operational Service Delivery Committee. So the power is in the name. Again, it's a bit dysfunctional. I've sat on it a couple of times. It's a bit dysfunctional, but they're responsible for endorsing actions on behalf of the Deputy Commissioner. So they've endorsed it as the people who are going to carry out the actions or carry over the actions because they get it twice. We tried to actually cut it out because it's quite slow, but they get it twice. They get the report, but they endorse the report and then they get the actions. So they're not blindsided. What we found previously was they were blindsided. The reports and the actions would come up together and hit those people and they would say, hang on, I didn't plan for any of that. That's going to require new bodies and budgets. I'm not ready for that. And the actions would die. We didn't go anywhere. So they are key decision makers. They have got a level of responsibility, but they've also got resource. Kat, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah. Fine.
To give it more weight, we landed on what we think is a game changer. You might think it's absolutely routine. We coded, and it's actually in the AIDR handbook, the companion guide. We coded the observations, particularly for Seroja, tropical cyclone Seroja, to 2 capability frameworks. The one on the left one is the state level State Emergency Management Committee Emergency Management Framework. When we identify things that are lessons or against the terms of reference, typically our terms of reference are anchored in that. That's the high level systemic stuff. So when we see high level systemic observations or evidence that points to one of those elements around that wheel, we're really interested, and that's typically where our lessons are pitched. So what we call them is systemic or enterprise level lessons. They're the organisational blind spots, and that's what we're accountable to the government. Typically, in a real basic term, and we haven't quite landed this, but in a real basic term, typically anything that can't be resolved through single command or single department resolution would sit in that space. It needs collaboration, it's going to need coordination, cross-jurisdiction potentially, and most importantly, it's probably going to need money back from state government. Now, when we put the project proposal up, it's anchored in that. It's actually anchored in a state level authorising environment. The stuff on the right, that's more tactical level, and that's based on the capability model hoisted. Some of you may have seen it before. It's ex-military. There's a number of capability models in the handbook and in the companion guide. This is the one that DFES uses. This graphic actually comes out of a noetic report, a consultant's report, but it references the CFA, or at that time, the CFA capability model. Really strong. And what we're sensing is that those observations, so people will give us observations that may not necessarily line up to the terms of reference, and we don't care. We just want observations, tell us stuff. Those ones that don't fit in the terms of reference, we look against hoisted for internal agency capability gaps. What are we missing? Where are the gaps at? What are we missing? What do we need to adjust? And we've found that to be a very valuable way of doing it, because our purpose is in sustaining or improving operational outcomes. They're the things we can do something about typically using internal resources or reorganising. The ones on the left, the coloured chart, are typically higher level stuff. So we found that to be quite a significant way to improve operational outcomes on the right, the grey boxes, and address or highlight enterprise risk on the left. So we're trying to use existing and established structures wherever we can. And I'll keep moving on because I know we're close to time. I'll miss that one out. The reality is, whilst it sounds awesome, not unlike most of the lessons management presentations that I've seen across the agencies, we're building the plane as we're flying it. We've got some significant high-level after-action reviews on the table now. We've got several historical after-action reviews that weren't completed that we're trying to close out. And there was a severe weather event in February this year that had 4 concurrent level 3, there's no more levels after level 3, 4 concurrent level 3 bushfires all at the same weekend that stripped out all of our resources across the state. What we know is we can't keep doing things the way we were doing them. And if we are to, and I'm around this organisation for a bit longer, if we are to sustain or improve operational outcomes, we have to change, and we're using the combination of the authorising environment, the advocacy, I'm still working on the advocacy pushing forward, and the defence, the defendable space I talked about, the defendable space of national best practice, ARDR handbooks, talking collaboratively, anchoring in good practice, using capability models that are all existing to demonstrate what we're doing. It appears to be working. The proof will be in the acceptance if our next couple of reports get through the executive chicane. My last question for you, for the group, as we are moving on for time, I'm going to stop sharing this. I'll work out how to do it. Is what I really, really, really want to know, and I haven't landed on this one yet, is when is a lesson learned? Is it, and I'll come back to Simon, thanks for that. Is it when it's just tacit knowledge? Is that enough? Have we learned it if it's tacit knowledge and retained? Is it explicit knowledge? Does it require explicit knowledge? And I think I might have answered my last question, one of my earlier questions. Is it explicit knowledge? Is it when it's written down and carried on from person to person? That's a lot of knowledge. That's tons. My doctrine team, I've only got one person in my doctrine team at the moment. Or is it when it becomes organisational knowledge? And I think I might have answered my question earlier. I'm happy to take comments on this, which is a combination of the both. What I'm really interested in is creating a stable and sustainable method for doing this that will outlive me sitting in this seat, because we have a tenure policy. So for the group, please, when is a lesson learned?
Can I ask a question? And so, where did we? I may have missed this earlier, but where did we get to around the monitoring? Was this? Was the monitoring? There's evaluating, and monitoring as well. And essentially, it's observing what's happening, right? So why aren't things sticking? Which kind of, and it does tie back to your question around when is a lesson learned.
So the evaluation monitoring, great point out there. The evaluation monitoring, so something different. It used to be with the lessons management team, but we can't own the actions for the organisation. So we have within DFES an audit and risk committee that sits in our strategy and governance section. Because those lessons or those capability gaps or those systemic gaps have now been raised in a report, we now know them as an organisation. They're no longer blind spots. The report and the actions go through to our corporate executive, which is our commissioner, deputy commissioners and executive directors. Oops, my camera's wandering. And they approve. So they've got a couple of options. They can approve the actions. They can reject the actions and live with the risk. If that's their risk appetite, we go, no, we're not going to do anything with that. We're going to accept that risk. Or they can hold it, and I hope they don't. I'd like them only have two options. Either approve it or reject it, but they can hold it for when the political environment changes. Once they've accepted those things, or once they've made a decision on that goes across to the strategy and governance section and audit and risk committee. And they track it on behalf of the whole organisation, because it's going to reach into multiple commands or departments. Key to all of that, and I said it earlier on, key to all of that is, I've said to my team, I don't want to see recommendations. We've got, because recommendations are approved in principle. We'll recommend a politician loves a recommendation because we approve them in principle, which means no bodies or no budgets. Do it anyway. So an already stressed workforce gets more stressed and then doesn't end up delivering on the things that are really important to the organisation, which means everything falls over. So
I think I may have seen that before.
I think I don't think that's particularly unique for emergency services or government.
Clinton, I'll put something up for you and then Bert can shoot me down. Our definition of when is a lesson learned, A, has the action plan been completed? Has all steps been completed? Because without that, you're going to get that lesson repeated.
Yep.
That's the most common cause of a repeat lesson, is the action plan wasn't completed. The question then is, within the various action types within that action, is there a quality assurance step? When you frame your action plan, do you frame some method of working out, has the lesson been learned? Now, that could be a spot exam, it could be an exercise, and that sort of thing. But just bear in mind the cost of doing that might be greater than the cost of the actual action plan. So you've got to be very careful about that. But that is about as far as you can go, because you cannot guarantee that lesson won't come up again in a different context or with different people, which is what we were talking about before. So that our classic definition is, has the action plan been fully completed? That's the first step.
Well, I really like that, Ian, and something that Lisa picked out again from her project management side of things is when we get to an action that whether it's an insight or a lesson, if it's got a corresponding action, we want to put a value proposition on that. What's the value to the organisation? If it's a low cost, high value, then we can move that through.
Yeah,
And
in our commercial industrial version of lessons learned, not in emergency services, we value every lesson. We put a value on it. And that value is what is used to decide which ones to tackle. But then what we do is on the dashboard, we repeatedly tell people the cumulative value of the lessons that have been completed. So we're saying to in an oil and gas company, your lessons learned system has delivered X dollars per annum annual saving. And boy, does that get focus. Now that's not essentially possible in an emergency services. So you have to drop back to your risk rating and talk about, you can do an analysis based on your risk profiles of how many lessons you have actually completed of those top risk categories. That's about the only way you can prove any sort of completion, in my view, anyway. But Bert's better able to talk to that.
I wouldn't disagree with you, Ian. I wouldn't shoot you down. I agree with all of that, mate. But it's probably not good news for you, Clinton, because I think we keep hearing that we're not learning the lessons. Well, we are. So how many thousands of people do we put through how many hundreds of courses every year that are deemed competent and, you know, are reassessed and are current? So where we're getting burnt is, I think, because things are not lessons and are never going to be learned. So on a catastrophic day, public information is never going to be perfect. So part of it is how we frame what success looks like. So I don't think in that context lessons matter. The only thing that matters is learning, because lessons learned, you know, the definitions are there around the change in behaviour, a sustained change in behaviour that's hopefully improved things, like a positive change in behaviour. But a lesson is learned, as Ian suggested, only up until the point where it's forgotten, or, you know, it's no longer relevant. As Dick said, lessons come from a particular context. So a lesson from the last fire does not necessarily make you better prepared for the next flood. So we are learning. We're probably learning 95% of our issues, but it's that 5%, most of which are not lessons. So I think we've got to stop calling them lessons. But a lesson from the past does not necessarily make you better prepared for the future. So learning them isn't necessarily a step forward. And that's what I'm talking about in this complexity, you know, to use Joe Buffoni buzzwords of, you know, complex, compounding, cascading, concurrent. So I've been working in biosecurity a little bit. I've moved on. I'm in New South Wales SES for a couple of months now, but we were writing a national exercise, you know, where the scenario was we got fires, we got floods, we got cyclones, we got a pandemic, we got supply chain issues, we got defence over in Tonga. You know, and 10 years ago, people would have said, that's ridiculous. That would never happen. But it is. That's the world we live in. So that's where this complexity, that's where the real challenge of dealing with that complexity and learning lessons from the past isn't going to help us. It's a part of the problem. It's part of the solution, rather, but it's not the solution.
I like that. What you described just then was I think it was the 10th of April last year for us when Tropical Cyclone Saroja hit. Whilst we had bushfires going and a pandemic, COVID got out in the middle of it, where I was in state ops at the time. We just moved through it. Yeah.
Can I just
11 years ago, we had 173 people die in the Black Saturday fires in Melbourne. My brigade was involved in a back action that stopped the fire jumping over into the National Forest and killing 1,200 people sitting in their cars in a queue trying to get out of the Dandenongs. We focus on the 173, but not on the 1,200 we saved. Is that an issue with lessons as well, where we did implement the lesson, we made massive difference, but you're only measuring the goals against?
So can I jump in on that one? So we had a very clever commissioner in 2014 where we had 74 houses destroyed in Parkville up near where I live. No fatality, 74 houses. killed in their Aussie startups at the time in our planning cell. And a very clever, digressing a bit, but a very clever commissioner went, okay, let's do some modelling on what would happen if we did intervene. And he actually framed it in property saved. Very clever, good amount of spin on it, but it changed the narrative. If we're talking about sustaining or improving operation outcomes, that culture bit is really important, that people are telling us the good stuff, what worked. That a small, from my personal experience, a smaller incident management team with a higher level of capability is better than a big one blown out that creates its own weather system that, you know, feeds the beast. You need more accommodation officers to accommodate the accommodation officers. Yeah. That's a good experience. I certainly, I like that. I like that as well, Simon.
Can I just pick up on Bert's exercise bit? It is my understanding, and this goes to Bert's looking to the future business. It's my understanding the US Air Force does not collect lessons from observations. It only collects lessons from planned exercises, A versus B versus C trials. So you know, the use of an exercise to form a lesson, I think, is undervalued at the moment.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, but I don't agree that our current construct of exercises give us more valid outcomes than lessons from operations. Most of our sectors, our current construct of exercising is not designed to be an evaluation, is not designed to identify lessons. But I think, you know, going back to one of Clinton's earlier questions, I think some of the low-hanging fruit for lessons to demonstrate value is to be clearer around our collection priorities and be less reactive and more proactive. So it's a shame Jeff Cooper's not here, because Army have developed, I think it's 9 or 10 key questions. You know, what does Army want to know? And now they're developing their lessons collection plan to be able to answer those questions. So how do we add value? So just going out looking at stuff, whether it's from operations or exercises, will identify some stuff, but it's not necessarily going to give the grown-ups answers to questions that they don't already know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, mate. Look, we're definitely coming to the end of our time. I warned poor old Clint that if the conversation was good, it would expand and expand. And it has been really valuable. Brad, you've got your hand up. Do you want to make you the last question, and then we'll have Clint close off?
Yes. So it's more than of an observation. So we're talking about lessons around historic things that have happened that we want to learn from, correct? What we haven't really spoken about is the context that we're having to operate in. Now, and what hasn't been mentioned this evening in our conversation is around external events that we have no control over. Clint, you mentioned those level 3 fires. The change in climate is going to have a dramatic impact on the resourcing and services that can be delivered by emergency services in Australia. Australia is literally in the hot seat of significant climate change. We saw that with the floods. We saw that with the fires 2 years ago. And because we've had a quiet summer, it doesn't mean that's the end of it. All right. And we have a national leadership that has offering no insight as to how to manage it. So within the context of lessons learned and knowledge management, one of the things that we need to consider is where do we draw expertise from outside of emergency services that can help us. Now, I know that at CFA, for example, we have a weather and geological sciences experts and guys that study the bushlands and everything. But what's outside of that? Right? We are needing to deal with events that are outside of our historical memory that we can base our lessons off. So lessons learned is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but I think something we need to consider is what's happening externally that is going to impact what we do, that will impact how we apply these lessons, because we are applying, we're trying to learn from things that there's a precedent for, but we have events unfolding which has no precedent. So how do we respond? How do we adapt? So we talk about having adaptable, flexible services to respond to these incidents, and they're becoming wilder and more significant in terms of scale, right? So I think I also put it out there as something to consider around. So Clint, I think it comes back to your point earlier about leverage. How do you talk to your decision makers around, guys, and ladies, we need to take this shit seriously. And leverage, as we found out, is about somebody's going to be held accountable. If it all goes to shit and there's going to be a commission, somebody's going to be liable. So liability is a big thing, right? And the leverage is around we are needing to respond to things that we cannot predict anymore. That scale, the number of incidents that are unpredictable is shifting. And this is anecdotal. I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. So I think thinking about lessons and leverage and selling it to shift culture and organizational infrastructure around how you learn and how you become more flexible, I think that needs to be part of the conversation. Because I think Mark may have mentioned complexity earlier. And things are complex and they're moving at speed. It's not complex and it's one thing that's complex. The complexity is this messy spaghetti ball that is moving faster than we are able to keep up with. The coronavirus and its mutations is a case in point. We all think it's over because, you know, we have no restrictions anymore. It's ridiculous. We still have thousands of cases and the virus is doing what it's designed to do, to evolve and stay alive. Right? So I think this needs to be part of the conversation as well and part of the thinking, right? How do we prepare ourselves from an organization design perspective as well?
Do you want to comment on that, Clint? I mean, obviously, a lot of the fire services are around the fact that a tree burns down today exactly the same way it burnt down 150,000 years ago. But now it doesn't. 2 summers ago, we saw 23-metre flame heights on a 22-degree day, something we'd normally see on a 40-degree day. So something's changing, as Brad just mentioned. Do you want to quickly talk to that before we close off?
Well, I suppose there's probably 2 elements to that. One is, in terms of the lessons management process, I've asked my team in every report now to establish the antecedent events. So what are the precursor conditions that event occurred in? Easier to do in a large-scale natural hazard, more difficult to do in an urban fire. Urban fire, I'm looking at a lot more longitudinal study. And so by using our capability framework and having the antecedent events sitting around it, we can either look at events and I'm less inclined to do this, looking at incidents by incidents by incidents by incidents, but looking at more aggregated data set. And if we do it by capability element, we can actually pick off horizontally the capability elements that run through it. Given that DFES is an all-hazard agency, command and control coordination, or the resource distribution that occur in a bushfire, is exactly the same as a cyclone. It doesn't matter from an execution point of view. So I forgot to mention that that's the way we're using the capability models. We can either use it by incident, less inclined to do that for anyone who's in the military. It's chasing zero. You're trying to you're adjusting your gun sights after every shot. We don't want to do that. We create a group and then adjust off the group. To frame the larger scale study, we don't own that. We don't own that, but we can describe it as best as we can in the way that we present our reports. And hopefully, hope's not a strategy, but it's useful. If hope's your only strategy, then you're in trouble. Hopefully, someone, a greater mind, someone who picks up one of our major incident reports, and most of the next 2 are going to go to the minister and cabinet, and they look at those antecedent events, and someone somewhere is reading the bit about the antecedent conditions. That's priming the discussion is, I think, all we can do. You're absolutely right. Combine the shift in climate change, but also the shift in demographic land use planning. As an emergency management, PPRR, the first P is prevention and mitigation. Land use planning at the front end of that. Combine that with the conditions in and around. So I don't have an answer to that. I think what I'm looking for around those, and there's a whole other knowledge management leadership forum discussion about frequency and consequence, Stu. What we're talking about is those low frequency, high consequence events, in which recognition prime decision making doesn't work. And I love recognition prime decision making, but yes, it's open to confirmation bias. Those low frequency, high consequence event that there's no discretionary time. That's where I'm using my team to build operational knowledge based on principles, and we have to drive from where I sit on. We have to promote principles. Principles and capability are the two capability models, and delivering capability based on principles is the only way I think that certainly emergency services can survive in that complicated to complex kind of paradigm. And that's probably not a bad way to wrap things up.
Yeah.
Operationalising knowledge and operationalising lessons is what I'm about. I'm not a purist by any means. I've kind of fallen into this and I'm absorbing from the group. So I love the conversation. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the time. Thanks for the contributions. I think we might keep some channels open.
Yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to speak, Clint. It's great to have an operational minded speaker. This group is a very practical group. We love our theoretical discussions, but we want to see it land and the rubber hit the road. I'll hand over to Dick, and he's got a bit of a thought, and then he's going to tell us about next month's that's coming up.
Yes, just want to reference back to Clinton's work. For me, lesson learned is a bit strict for me, which is unless something changed, lesson hasn't been learned yet. Even you have the plan, if it hasn't been added on, it's still not yet learned. So that's for me. But I'm not sure, maybe other organizations, they may have other thoughts. And the other things I want to quickly point out is you mentioned about explicit and tacit knowledge. And I think that's really important because explicit knowledge is much scalable, but tacit knowledge is really difficult to scale. So that's why somewhat we do need to transform tacit knowledge into explicit. Even we can't totally do that because knowledge is not like a two spectrum. It's not like either black and white, explicit or tacit. It's more or less in the middle of somewhere. So, and the other bit is even you put it into an explicit format, the person who actually read that, the background of that particular person is actually affects how knowledge being absorbed and interpreted. So if your report like go to some medical doctor, that has nothing to do with them. They don't have the context to understand that. But if you give it to your colleagues or maybe a firefighter in US, they have the knowledge or they have the background or prior knowledge to understand that. So I think that's really important. But I'll just leave it there because it will be like another long discussion. And I want to point out the next meeting for us is we have Larissa Karma, which is from Information Africa organization. So what they are doing is something similar. They try to share knowledge and build capability in order to like to bring Africa's like a little bit more help them to in 4 areas actually is indigenous knowledge management system, intellectual property rights, legal policy framework, health, environment, a lot of things. So they have like 4 years, but because of COVID, somehow that's being like disrupt a bit. So it would be a good session that how they actually do it in Africa to promote knowledge building and also capability buildings.
And Dick, you wanted to highlight that won't be on the Wednesday next month. It'll be on the Tuesday, the 24th of May.
Yes, normally we have a session on Wednesday, but this one, because of the international speaker, so that will be on Tuesday, 6 p.m. That's May 24th.
Great. Well, I'm just putting a little thing here just to encourage you all to come along next month, but also to bring a friend, bring a work colleague. We really want to show that one of the beauties of COVID and the hybrid meetings is we've got to have people speak from around the world, and Africa has been a first for us. And this is our second speaker from Africa this year. It's really impressive what they're doing in the development space. So let's bring some people along and get 20, 30 people, 40 people online to really show our interest in the great work they're doing, because we live in luxury in organizational terms compared to what they're dealing with, and yet they're kicking goals. So it'd be really great to show our interest and our support for what they're doing. But Clint, thanks again. Wonderful session. I hope you got as much out of it as we did, seeing what you're doing there and the approach you're taking. It's lovely to see that combination of operational and intellectual. It's awesome. And we'll see you all next month.